Hi everyone, and thank you for watching this video reviewing how to create authentic performance tasks. Before we start, I want to say thank you. It is so humbling to work with such dedicated educators who not only love their students, but want them to grow not just academically, but socially and emotionally as well. This is the process that we need to go through in order to meet our mission of striving for excellence and embracing diversity. The second thing I want to say before we get into this is my hope is that this video is a confirmation of the good work that we are already doing. We are in many cases already creating authentic performance tasks for our students. So I hope that this highlights the great work that you are doing and maybe gives you some additional thinking strategies as you are reviewing and thinking about next year. So let's take a look. Now, I want to highlight what the Authentic Performance Task Committee last winter determined in terms of how we can characterize authentic performance tasks. And I'm not going to read these all out, but I do want to highlight that first bullet point, that authentic performance tasks allow for students to transfer their knowledge to a new situation. Think of a car mechanic. You can learn all about different models of cars, the different parts of cars, and the different processes to fix issues when cars break down. But you're not really going to learn how to be a mechanic until someone brings a car in with a specific problem, and you need to apply all of that knowledge to this situation. And when a second car comes in with a different problem, you're going to have to apply different knowledge to that situation. These are the kinds of things we want our students to be exposed to gain that knowledge and apply it to something new. So how can we do that? Well, there are two strategies that we can use to think about developing authentic performance tasks. And this first one comes from Wiggins and McTighe. They use an acronym called GRASPS, and this frames authentic performance tasks. If you can answer the components of GRASPS, then you have an authentic performance task. The first is the goal. What is the challenge or problem that the student needs to overcome? In every situation, in our jobs as teachers, we are constantly encountering challenges or problems that we need to face, that we need to solve. So let's go back to the mechanic issue. If I bring a car in and I say my check engine light is on, that's a problem that needs to be fixed. If I come in and say that I want you to alter my car, modify my car so that it can go faster, well, that's a challenge that I need to overcome. So what is the thing that students need to overcome or solve? The second part is role. So what is the role of the student in this situation? Because the role that they have is going to affect how they approach the challenge or problem. So using the car mechanic example again, if I'm the mechanic in this situation, I'm going to approach the problem differently than if I'm the driver. Because if I'm the driver, my goal is I need to communicate as accurately as possible what the problem is. Whereas if I'm the mechanic, how I need to approach this problem is I need to fix it using the data that I've been given, not only from what the car is telling me, but from what the driver is telling me as well. A is, what's the audience? Any kind of performance task has an audience that it's being directed to. Maybe that's professionals in the local community. Maybe that's other students in different classes. Maybe that's their peers. Maybe it's to administration. Performance tasks are meant to be shared. So who's the audience for that? S is for situation or scenario. That is the context for what the problem is. Using the car mechanic analogy, if someone brings a car in, let's say a 2004 Nissan Pathfinder, and they say that my check engine light is on. Can you identify what the problem is and fix it? Now the challenge is, what's the problem in fixing it? The scenario is the check engine light is on. For P, what's the actual product or performance that students are doing? What are they actually making out of this? A podcast, video essay, Socratic seminar reflection, a computer program, a musical piece, an artistic piece, a piece of engineering that they made in a 3D printer. They're able to add new vocabulary to their language. They're able to use mathematical processing and gather data in order to graph changes over time. They're able to create lab results based on a challenge or problem. These are all the things that students are making. And the last is standards. Now, what we care about is how is it actually being assessed? What is the grading tool for this? Now, we're going to touch on how to do that process in a future video. But for right now, we're thinking about what kind of rubric is this and what kind of checklist are we looking with. And that depends on the type of standard that we have. A second way to determine how to create authentic performance tasks is using this type of graphic organizer. Now, we already do this in our minds when we create our assessments, but it's nice to have it written down, especially when we encounter a standard that we might have difficulty seeing how that can be demonstrated with our students. So we have 3 different questions or 3 different prompts in this organizer. First, if the desired result is for learners 2, so this is where we would put in our standard, then we move on to stage 2. Then you need evidence of the student's ability to X. So in the example here, this is an economics standard, price is a function of supply and demand. What I have to do is think about the types of simple and complex thinking, simple and deep understanding, that students would need to demonstrate in order to really learn that. You have to first understand the foundational ideas before you can really do some higher order thinking. So in this case, students would need to explain why similar items might command very different prices based on supply and demand. That's going to let me know as a teacher, okay, you understand the concept, you can relate that. Now, that wouldn't be really reflected in my performance task because this is a fairly simple understanding issue, especially for middle school and high school, elementary school. Maybe the standard is to explain. So a simpler action verb or simpler skill that they can use is recall, recognize, identify. So that way we're scaffolding the types of thinking that students are doing. Then we could say that in terms of higher order thinking, they need to interpret data on prices and apply by studying the right prices for items being sold. So we're able to figure out what are the types of thinking students need to do. Then what we can do is think about the assessments that we can individually apply to each type of thinking. So if I need my students to explain why similar items might command different prices, then my assessment for this, and this would be a formative, would look like an oral or written explanation of why prices of specific items vary as a function of supply and demand. So maybe after watching a flip video or reading a text in an informative text or other resource that we have, I may ask them to answer a couple of short answer questions. Or maybe we're going to be doing a simulation in class and I want you to do some reflection questions where I can assess if you know that. Whereas for interpretation and application, notice in both cases they're making something. So developing a PowerPoint presentation and conducting consumer research. Now, if you notice in those 2 higher order thinking skills scenarios, you can combine both of those assessments where they could conduct consumer research and make a PowerPoint presentation based on the research that they get. So what this process does is it takes a standard, it breaks it down to the type of thinking students need to do, and it aligns our formative and summative assessments. So what does that actually look like with the standards that we have? So in this particular case, I'm going to use 2 examples. The first is we're going to look at 2 high school English standards, and then we're going to look at a elementary school math example, both using Common Core. So this particular standard notes that students are going to determine a theme or central idea of a text and analyze its detail, its development over the course of the text, including how it emerges and is shaped and refined by specific details. There's a second part. They need to provide an objective summary of the text. So this is a massive standard. So what I need to do is think about the types of thinking students need to do. Now, really, there are 3 things in this standard. They need to determine a theme or central idea of a text. They need to provide an objective summary of the text, and they need to analyze the development of that theme over the course of a text. So what I'm going to do is first focus on the simpler thought processes students need to do on this standard. So I'm going to touch on determining a theme or central idea of a text and providing an objective summary of the text. So some simple understanding they need to do. So they need to do some identification, just find something. In this case, they would need to find a theme or central idea of a text. It could be a novella, a novel, a short story, a poem, an informative piece, an argumentative piece. Can you just find what the central idea is? Can you find what the theme is? And then they'd also need to identify parts of the text that supports the theme. So if you tell me that the theme is overcoming adversity, well, can you point to something in the text that tells me that? Now, they're not explaining it. It's literally, can you find it? Now, in terms of what kind of assessment that I could give them for that, they would need to maybe provide an oral. They could tell me. They could write it down. Maybe if they want to do some artistic identification, I want to make sure they can approach it in multiple ways. So they can identify a theme throughout the course of the text. So I can give them multiple examples, short examples, long examples, find the theme, tell me something that supports it. Where did you get that idea? And I got to make sure that they come from parts of the text. The second type of simpler thinking that students need to do is they need to do two things. First, they need to explain the theme of the text. If they say the theme is overcoming adversity and here's where it is. Okay, well, why does that part of the text make you think that's the theme or the central idea? So that's where they get the explanation in. The other thing they have to explain is a summary of the text. So they need to be able to tell me an accurate summary. So what assessments can we use in this? Well, again, I like to give them lots of examples so they can give me an oral or written or artistic summary of the text. Maybe I could ask them to do all three, an oral, written, and artistic summary using different sources. And that gives me lots of formative assessment to see if they can do that skill. Then I could ask them to do, again, provide an oral, written, artistic explanation of a theme throughout the course of a text. So these are things that I would be doing throughout the unit to see, are they able to demonstrate the basic foundational knowledge and skills to be successful on this. And I can give them lots of immediate feedback. We can do this lots of times. We could do it over a few days, or we could do it in 10 minutes if I give them a very small piece. These are great formative assessments. This is good data that I can get back as a teacher to say, okay, are they doing the basics right? And if they're having some issues, I need to adjust my instruction. I need to make sure everyone can get to this basic level. But all of these are formative assessments. Nothing here would reflect a summative assessment and authentic performance task. So now let's take care of the third part of the standard, the analysis section. So the third part we haven't touched on in the standard is that students can analyze in detail the theme of a text and its development over the course of the text, including how it emerges and is shaped and refined by specific details. So what's the initial theme? How does that change and develop as we read a novella, a novel, a short story, even a poem? Maybe even a video essay or a podcast. So the type of thinking that students are doing is clearly analysis. This is where we really want to point out those key terms, those Bloom's taxonomy types of thinking in the standard. So they would need to, and I'm just taking the language of the standard here, they need to analyze the development of a theme over the course of a text using evidence, right? You can't analyze something unless you can justify it using evidence. So I need an assessment that allows them to analyze a text. Now, what text? That's going to be up to me. That's where we need to know the sociocultural environment of our students and know what's going to be best connecting with them and their experiences. So assessments that I can use for this is maybe they're going to conduct an investigation of a text's theme. They're going to deep dive into it, which is where they can figure out what is the theme, how does that develop over time. And again, I'm using the language of the standard here. So highlighting when the theme emerges. So when do we first see the theme come up? What are some key story events that develop that theme and illuminate different aspects of that theme? And why is that theme important to the discipline or an audience? So whenever a writer is writing a piece and they have to have a theme, well, what is the point of that? Any type of written piece is written to an audience. So why is that theme important to whatever audience that they're writing to? Now, maybe that might not be relevant to the readers today, but maybe when it was written 100, 200 years ago, it was a very relevant theme for people who were reading it at the time. So now what I can do is, as I've determined the type of thinking that is being done, I've been able to identify a higher order thinking skill. So now I can try to put that into a performance task. But I want to hit one more standard. So I want to compare that standard with the second one. This is a speaking standard. So in this case, this standard says that students will be able to present information, findings, and supporting evidence clearly, concisely, and logically, such that listeners can follow the line of reasoning and the organization, development, substance, and style are appropriate to purpose, audience, and task. So can they accurately present information so an audience can follow it? So I'm going to do the same process here. So what are the simple understanding processes students need to do? Well, they need to identify. So where are pieces of data and evidence that you can take and use into some sort of presentation to create a coherent narrative? So can you find something? Then you have to be able to explain your findings and supporting evidence so that I can follow you. So you need to find all of your data, then you need to explain all of that data so that I can follow you as a listener. And then in terms of higher order thinking skills, this is where the creation part comes in. Because when you do a presentation, you're creating something, whether that's just a speech, you've still had to craft that, or you're creating a presentation that has audio and video elements into it. So they need to create a clear, concise, and logical presentation. I'm taking that language from the standard of an argument that's appropriate for a specific audience and task. Again, I'm taking that from the language of the standard. So now I need to think about in my unit, what are they going to need to do in terms of formative and summative assessments for me to know that they're doing that type of thinking? So in terms of identify, give me a collection of the data that is focused on a purpose and task. So this can be a series of quotes. This can be a series of statistical data points, quantitative and qualitative data points. Just show me that you found evidence or findings that you're going to present later. In terms of explain, give me a clear outline of the findings and the evidence the students use in the presentation. So if I can look at an outline, there's your explanation. I can look at that and as a reader follow that in terms of a cohesive narrative. I can give great formative assessment feedback on that. And in terms of a summative assessment, I could say they're going to develop an oral presentation. So they're going to stand in front of the class and speak that engages and effectively argues a point of view. Now notice I've got two standards here. And I want to focus on, we have three types of thinking, or rather two types of thinking that needs to happen. They need to create, and I need to get them something where they're going to analyze. So analyze a theme over time, and you need to create a presentation on that. Well, now what I can do is go to grasps. So, and I'll just move my little cursor a bit so you can see. So you are a literary podcast host. So that's the role. You're making a new episode, so that's the scenario, you're creating a new episode that, and here's the challenge, analyzes the recurring theme of struggle being integral to success. So here's a theme that I want you to identify in a text, including how it develops. Now, what are they actually going to make? They're going to create a podcast episode, and their audience is for an audience of 13 to 18-year-olds. Now, if I said 5-year-olds, how that podcast is created is going to be very different. If I said it was for college professors, academics, that podcast is going to be a little different. So this age group frames the type of podcast that they're going to be using. Now, I can find some great examples of podcasts that we can talk about in the beginning of the unit so that they know what that looks like. So this would be a basic description of what I'd ask them to do, and then I would flesh that out when I actually make the task sheet. Let's look at a second example. This is for an elementary school Common Core math standard. So in this particular standard, students will draw points, lines, line segments, rays, angles, and perpendicular and parallel lines, and they're going to identify these in two-dimensional figures. So these types of mathematical geometric processes, they need to be able to draw, and they need to identify them in two-dimensional, not three-dimensional figures. So again, I'm going to think about what are the simple understanding processes students need to go through first. So they need to identify, ooh, that's a point, that's a line segment, that's a ray. So you can look at some of these geometric patterns and say, oh, that's X. In terms of other simple understanding processes, they need to be able to explain it. Well, why is that a point? Why is that a line? How do you know that? Explain that to me. So what does a line look like? What's the characteristics of it? And what's the difference between a line and a line segment? What's the difference between a line an array. Now, these are all formative assessments I can do throughout the course of the unit to make sure do students have the basic knowledge that they can then apply to whatever my summative assessment is going to be. So in terms of identify, they can give me oral or written identification of points, line segments, rays, angles, perpendicular and parallel lines. Those are those basic mathematical processes questions that we have in our text. Here are a bunch of sample questions. Do it. Can you identify it? In terms of explanation, I can give them an oral/written explanation, so I can give them multiple formative assessments of how points, lines, line segments, rays, angles, and perpendicular and parallel lines can be identified and differentiated. So I can ask them, well, how do you know that's a line and not a ray? How do you know that's a line segment? How do you know that's a perpendicular line as opposed to a parallel line? So that gets them to do a little bit more explanation and thought process. Now, and by the way, this is for, I believe, 4th grade. So in terms of elementary school, that's the context. Now, if this was for, let's say, a geometric standard for kindergarten, the higher order thinking skill may be explanation. And again, I always need to go back to the standard on that. Now, in terms of the higher order thinking skill, this is creation. Because they need to draw these things, they actually need to draw and create points, line segments, rays, angles, and perpendicular and parallel lines. So they need to create that. So 2D drawings of that. So my assessment could be to construct a 2D drawing that uses points, lines, line segments, rays, angles, and perpendicular and parallel lines. So I'm able to figure out, here's what they need to do to get to that type of thinking that the standard requires. Now I need to think about the type of summative assessment that I can pair with that type of thinking. Now, in terms of math, there are a lot of great things that can be done in terms of the professional world we can draw on. And especially with elementary school, basic construction, basic making things is a great entry point for mathematical thought processes. So in this case, we're going to say their role is they are an architect. And the scenario is they're going to be explaining to construction workers. So it's not just you're an architect and publishing something. You have to explain it to people who are not in your discipline. And the challenge is how to build a house from your blueprints. So you have to make blueprints and you have to explain it to an audience that may not understand. So what are they actually making? They're going to create a blueprint for a house that uses points, lines, line segments, rays, angles, and perpendicular and parallel lines, and they need to explain that blueprint in terms of audience to an audience of construction workers. So here's my blueprint, here's what all these things are, here's the audience that I have. Now again, I would flush that out more in terms of when I actually make my task sheet, but I have a clear idea of here's what I'm actually going to ask them to do, and we know that it's aligned with our standard in this unit. Now, I am sure throughout this process, I did not answer every question that you had. Maybe I was unclear on something and needed to repeat something. I did do this video in one take. So if you have a question that is for your discipline or your classes, maybe I didn't give examples that can be really applicable. Maybe I didn't say something that could help you as you are thinking about and reviewing your classes for next year. Please reach out to me. I am here as a resource to equip you with anything you need to meet the needs of your students. And I want to partner with you in that process. So please reach out, send me some sample assessments. If you want to meet and we could work through one, please, I am here for whatever you need. Thanks for watching the video. Have a great day.